Welcome to Mexico Unexplained, where we will explore the magic, the mysteries, and the miracles of Mexico. This series presents information based partly on theory and conjecture. The podcaster's purpose is to suggest some possible explanation, but not necessarily the only ones to the subjects we will examine. Here is your host, Robert Bitto.
Welcome, and muy bienvenidos to episode number 100 of Mexico Unexplained, where we examine the magic, the mysteries, and the miracles of Mexico. I'm your host, Robert Bitto. Was he a white, bearded god who vowed to return, or a flying dragon who terrorized the skies? Was he a king of the Toltecs or two kings? Was he a god or multiple gods? Was he a real person? Was he just a conglomeration of myths or legends that has changed over time? Quetzalcoatl is perhaps the most famous and enigmatic figure in the history of Mexico. At the time of the Spanish conquest, Quetzalcoatl was known as the plumed serpent god who came from a long tradition of similar representations. The earliest reference to the feathered serpent deity in ancient Mexico appears in the Olmec times, around 900 BC at the city of La Venta in the modern-day Mexican state of Tabasco. While not as fleshed out as the later representations of Quetzalcoatl, the Olmec plumed serpent shows that the iconography of feathered snakes dates back thousands of years. The first major civilization in ancient Mexico to adopt on a widespread basis what has been commonly recognized as Quetzalcoatl was Teotihuacan. The massive ancient city with its Avenue of the Dead, its gigantic pyramids of the sun and moon, also had a temple dedicated to the feathered serpent god. The iconic heads sticking out of stone abutments are easily recognizable. As the city-state had no writing system, and Teotihuacan collapsed about 1,000 years before the arrival of the Spanish, archaeologists and ethnohistorians know very little about the feathered serpent god and how it fit into this civilization. It is unclear whether or not the plumed snake deity at Teotihuacan had many of the same attributes of the later god known as Quetzalcoatl, found in other parts of Mexico. With the collapse of the ancient city of Teotihuacan, there existed a power vacuum in central Mexico, which would soon be filled by what archaeologists called the Toltec civilization. Like Teotihuacan, the Toltecs had no written language to pass down their stories in written form, and their culture was not intact and alive at the time of the Spanish conquest. In fact, some scholars debate whether or not the Toltecs were an actual civilization and claim that they were more of a legendary people made up to explain the origins of the Aztecs. Through Aztec stories and legends, we have some interesting information about Quetzalcoatl in the Toltec era, dating roughly from 900 to 1200 AD. It was during this time when we see Quetzalcoatl being referred to as one or more historical figures, and whether or not the person or persons called Quetzalcoatl were actually real is still up for debate. Researchers have to go with Aztec stories about the Toltecs to get any sort of sense of who or what the plumed serpent actually was during this time in Mexican history. According to the legends, the Toltecs were a wandering group before they came down from the north to settle central Mexico, building their first capital city at Culhuacan in the Valley of Mexico. The king who led his people to live a more settled life in the Valley of Mexico was named Tecapotl-Mixcoatl. When this first king died, his son, Tolpiltzin-Quetzalcoatl, assumed control and moved the Toltec capital to Tula in the modern Mexican state of Hidalgo. This was said to have happened in the year 968 AD. Quetzalcoatl, the man, became a religious reformer and was credited with eliminating human sacrifice from religious rituals. He was also the one credited for developing the finer aspects of Toltec civilization. He was the patron of craftspeople, and the best feather workers, metallurgists, sculptors, and artisans of all other types were encouraged to come to Tula from all parts of Mesoamerica. As Toltec civilization was flourishing, Quetzalcoatl had many rivals. Chief among them was a lord from the north called Tezcatlipoca. In one version of the story, Tezcatlipoca humiliated Quetzalcoatl in front of his people by getting him so intoxicated that he neglected his religious duties and brought shame to the priestly kingship that his father created. In disgrace, Quetzalcoatl left the Toltec capital, and what happened after he left Tula is somewhat confusing, and there are several accounts explaining the fate of Quetzalcoatl. In one version of the story, he left with an entourage and headed east until he got to the shores of the Gulf of Mexico. When he arrived at the sea, he set fire to himself and ascended to the heavens to become the morning star, or the planet Venus. In another version, Quetzalcoatl also made it to the Gulf of Mexico and boarded a raft made of snakes, sailing off to the east and vowing to return. In yet another version, Quetzalcoatl traveled south and east to modern-day Central America. The town of Cuscatlan, in the modern nation of El Salvador, is said to have been founded by the exiled Toltec king. Some archaeologists theorize that a Quetzalcoatl-like figure may have been responsible for the Toltec influence in the Maya-dominated Yucatan, causing the rise of the city of Chichen Itza. While the connections to central Mexico and the post-classic Maya are indisputable, it is unknown whether or not a historical figure in the form of an exiled king named Quetzalcoatl is responsible for a Maya renaissance 1,000 years ago. The Aztecs were a living, breathing civilization at the time of the Spanish conquest, and because of this, so much is known about Quetzalcoatl in an Aztec context, although many competing stories abound regarding this feathered serpent god. This was the nature of religion in central Mexico. Although there were many similarities of gods and stories among interrelated tribes and cultures, there was no overarching final authority when it came to religious dogma. Although a few Aztec emperors tried standardizing religious beliefs, almost codifying them into a state religion to be observed throughout the empire, there were many myths and variety of myths that often opposed one another. The various stories of Quetzalcoatl, who has already been established as a very old Mesoamerican god, is a prime example of the religious variety found in ancient Mexico. Starting with his creation, there are many versions of how Quetzalcoatl came to be. In one version of the story, he is one of the 400 children of the snake-skirted goddess Coatlicue. In another version, the goddess Chimalman is the mother of Quetzalcoatl, and there are a few stories about how she became pregnant with him. In one story, she is a virgin who is impregnated by the god Onteoy while she was dreaming. In another story, Chimalman swallows a piece of jade or emerald and becomes pregnant with Quetzalcoatl. That jade story has two versions of its own. In one, Chimalman is an unmarried young woman, and in the other she is a widow whose husband had passed away years before. In yet another version, Quetzalcoatl is the son of the god-goddess of duality, a vaguely understood deity called Ometeotl, who lives in the highest layer of heaven. There are many other legends about Quetzalcoatl's origins, some very difficult to verify. Quetzalcoatl's many attributes and functions are as numerous as his birth stories. As the son of Ometeotl, he is one of the lords of the cardinal directions and was assigned to the west. Throughout most of Mesoamerica, he is seen as a bringer of light, justice, learning, and creativity. He gave the people writing and the calendar. As a just god, he was opposed to human sacrifice, but some accounts contradict this. He is also seen as the protector of butterflies, and some researchers believe that this symbolizes resurrection. As the morning star or Venus, Quetzalcoatl is known as Tlahuitzcalpantecutli. As the wind, he is known as a Hecate. In some texts and reference materials, these are separate gods, but in many accounts these are just aspects of Quetzalcoatl and forms he may take. In many Mesoamerican accounts, Quetzalcoatl is responsible for creating many of the living things we see in our current world, the fifth world, according to many ancient Mexican peoples. After the fourth world was destroyed, Quetzalcoatl went to the Aztec underworld called Mictlan, gathered up some old bones, added his own blood to those bones, and created humans and animals. He also created corn, the staple crop of all ancient Mexican civilizations. High priests in the Aztec world were often given the honorific title of Quetzalcoatl. This was also done in other Mesoamerican cultures. It's evident that there are many confusing and contradictory legends and attributes ascribed to Quetzalcoatl. It is often difficult to cut through the embellishments and rewritings and reinterpretations of the early Spanish accounts to get to the heart of who Quetzalcoatl was. We are left wondering if he was really a man, a god, or just a legend. In a way, Quetzalcoatl is much like the Mexican artist Frida Kahlo. He can be many things to many people even well into the modern day, almost 500 years after the Spanish conquest. We will now look at two post-conquest interpretations of Quetzalcoatl that millions of people believe to be true, but may have no basis whatsoever in fact or even in ancient Mexican legend. The first is the idea that Spanish conquistador Hernán Cortés was mistaken for a returning Quetzalcoatl, and that is one of the reasons why it was so easy for the Spanish to conquer the Aztec Empire. The other is the idea of Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ, who came to the ancient Americas to spread the Gospels after his time was up in the Middle East. The Christ-Quetzalcoatl connection has primarily been promoted by members of the U.S.-based Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, more commonly known as the Mormons, since the latter half of the 19th century. The story of the Spanish conquest of Mexico has long been told and retold, with many twists added to the story, about a handful of Europeans bringing down one of the mightiest empires in the world at the time. We often hear that it was relatively easy for Cortés to subdue the Aztecs owing to the fact that the Emperor Montezuma had thought that the Spaniard could have been the returning god Quetzalcoatl, and that this is the reason why he was so eager to receive Cortés as an invited guest. This idea of the Cortés-Quetzalcoatl confusion has been examined in great depth in recent years. It turns out that there is not a single source from the years immediately after the conquest talking about Montezuma mistaking Cortés for a returning god. The one source often quoted is the Florentine Codex, written some 50 years after Cortés's first entrance into the Aztec capital of Tenochtitlan. In that document, there is a speech made by Montezuma, often quoted, that the emperor was saving the throne for the Spaniard. This has been reinterpreted in recent years as being mere politeness, if the speech ever happened at all. There were no contemporary references to this speech in letters from Cortés to the King of Spain or in the writings of those who took part in the conquest. Researchers have traced the origin of the Cortés as Quetzalcoatl legend back to the 1530s Franciscans, who had millennial beliefs and wanted to tie the arrival of the Spanish to the fulfillment of ancient prophecy. The supposed prophecy fulfillment would pave the way for an easy evangelization of the Americas in order to usher in the second coming of Christ. The seeding of the story by the Franciscans may have been a way of making the conquest more acceptable to the native peoples, and thus make them easier to convert to Christianity. In a way, the Franciscan clergymen used the Aztecs' Quetzalcoatl story against them by convincing the generation after the conquest that the presence of the Spanish was divinely ordained according to their own ancient beliefs. The idea of Quetzalcoatl as Jesus Christ visiting another flock in the Americas may not have been first proposed by the Mormons, but they helped to make the idea more mainstream and more widely disseminated. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, often abbreviated LDS, believes in a second testament of Christ called the Book of Mormon, which describes Christ's ministry in the Americas in ancient times. In addition to what is detailed in the Book of Mormon, LDS people cite John 10:16, where Christ said, quote, "And other sheep I have, that are not of this fold, them also I must bring, and they will hear my voice, and there will be one flock and one shepherd." End quote. While not official church doctrine, many Mormons believe that Quetzalcoatl is the historical Christ in the ancient Americas. In his 1882 work, Meditations and Atonement, Mormon Church President John Taylor wrote about the link between Jesus and Quetzalcoatl. Quote, "The story of the life of the Mexican divinity Quetzalcoatl closely resembles that of the Savior, so closely indeed that we can come to no other conclusion that Quetzalcoatl and Christ are the same being. But the history of the former has been handed down to us through an impure, Lamanitish source, which has sadly disfigured and perverted the original incidents and teachings of the Savior's life and ministry." End quote. When that was written in the 1880s, very little was known about the civilizations of ancient Mexico. The science of archaeology had not yet been invented, and serious scholarly research into Quetzalcoatl was a century away. The many legends and varieties of legends already touched upon have been floating around for years, with many things added to and embellishing the Quetzalcoatl legend. Many contemporary LDS church members cite some unsubstantiated legends and yet unproven archaeological evidence when staking their claim on Jesus as Quetzalcoatl. For example, the idea of the bearded white god, supposedly, came from the idea that the feathered serpent was really the bearded serpent and had somehow gotten corrupted over time. The big problem with this is that no depiction of Quetzalcoatl ever has him with a beard or looking Caucasian in appearance. He is depicted similarly across time with slight variations. Please go to MexicoUnexplained.com for illustrations or check out our slideshow on YouTube for even more. Still other groups ascribe other things to Quetzalcoatl. Perhaps he was a reptilian from another dimension, the Hollow Earth, or another star system. Perhaps he was a time traveler or even an ancient visitor from India. New theories and augmentations of old legends seem to pop up every year. While the idea of Quetzalcoatl may seem murky at times, and the real story or history may seem impossible to get to, there is no doubt that Quetzalcoatl played a huge impact on the history and culture of ancient Mexico. Thank you once again for listening to another episode of Mexico Unexplained. Remember to like and subscribe to us on YouTube and follow us on Twitter. Tell your friends by sharing these shows with others. Please go to our website, MexicoUnexplained.com, for references, illustrations, and for free access to transcripts of past shows. Please visit Amazon.com to purchase the book, Mexico Unexplained, to get a hard copy of The Magic, the Mysteries, and the Miracles of Mexico. We appreciate your kind attention once again. Until next time, thank you and gracias.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Mexico Unexplained with host Robert Bitto. For show summary, relevant links and commentary, please check out our website at mexicounexplained.com. Like us on Facebook and be a part of the conversation. Adios and hasta la vista.